Welcome to Sleepy Historian, where the stories are soft, the voices are gentle, and the past unfolds one calm breath at a time. This is your space for boring history for sleep, a place where we embrace the quiet corners of the past, not with urgency or drama, but with stillness, curiosity, and a little candlelight. Whether you're here for bedtime relaxation and soft storytelling, or simply to let your mind drift off beside the sea, you've found the right ship. Tonight, we begin a story not of battle or bloodshed, but the sky and the sea. Imagine it. You're aboard a Viking longship, the creak of wood beneath you, the salt of the ocean in the air, and overhead the stars, uncountable, silent, and always watching. There is no compass in your hand, no map to unfold, just a memory of constellations passed down from fathers and grandfathers. Polaris, the North Star, quietly anchoring the night sky. The sweep of Ursa Major, like a bear lumbering above. You row through darkness, guided not by sight, but by centuries of stories in the rhythm of the stars. This is not a tale of violence or conquest. It's a history sleep story, told in soft tones, designed to help you fall asleep to calm bedtime storytelling, to let your thoughts slow, like the oars gliding through open water. Because no, the Vikings didn't have GPS. They had the night sky, and somehow that was enough. So if this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it? It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there, falling asleep to the same old stories. Let the light dim, let the stars whisper, let the wind speak, and let the myths unfold. We begin now. How Vikings navigated oceans without maps or compasses. A soft-spoken history documentary for those who love archaeology, seafaring myths, Roman history, and the comfort of knowing the past moves more slowly than the present. You are here. The stars are waiting. Imagine yourself standing on a rocky Scandinavian shore over 1,000 years ago. The wind is sharp, carrying with it the scent of brine and pine. In front of you, a longship rests sleek, narrow, and carved with dragon-headed prows. Its curved hull seems to ripple like the ocean it is built to conquer. This was the beginning for many Norsemen, not the end of the world, but its edge. And beyond it, opportunity, mystery, fear, adventure, but no map to guide them. In the early days of what we now call the Viking Age, beginning around the late 8th century, a seafaring culture emerged from the fjords and forests of Scandinavia. While they would one day become known across Europe as raiders and warriors, they were first and foremost explorers, guided by courage, the stars, and a deep relationship with the sea. These Norsemen, often from tight-knit farming communities, built ships not just for battle, but for long-distance travel, to reach distant coasts, to trade, to settle, and to see what lay beyond the next horizon. And they did all of this without maps, without charts, and without compasses. They set out across the North Sea, the Baltic, the English Channel, and even the vast, cold North Atlantic, reaching as far west as Iceland, Greenland, and the far shores of Finland, likely part of modern-day Newfoundland in Canada. And how did they do it? It begins with a longship, a masterpiece of both engineering and adaptation. Shallow drafted, light, and symmetrical at both ends, these vessels could slice through open ocean or glide into shallow rivers. Built with overlapping planks and flexible ribs, they were both strong and supple, bending with the sea rather than fighting it. Their crews were lean and practiced, farmers, traders, and sometimes warriors. Each man had his place and his task. Some rowed, some kept watch, some tended supplies, and one, always, was a navigator, not a captain in the modern sense, but a guide who had memorized stars, coastlines, and stories told by those who had sailed before. These journeys were not casual. Every supply had to be calculated: dried fish, barley cakes, smoked meats, animal skins for water storage, tools, and sometimes animals. Everything had to survive weeks or months at sea, often exposed to storms, cold and salt spray. They could not afford to get lost. Yet the ocean has no roads, and on foggy days, not even a horizon. Still, the Vikings pressed forward. They trusted the sea signs. They watched the birds. They listened to the wind. And above all, they looked to the sky. But before we follow the stars, we must first understand the kind of mindset it takes to sail into the unknown with only memory and intuition. A mindset forged not in comfort, but in hardship and hope. For a Viking, the sea was a passage, not a barrier. It could separate or unite, offer life or threaten it. It was a space between known and unknown. And so they set forth. From tiny villages and icy fjords, their longship slipped into gray mist, no compass, no map, only a firm hand on the tiller and a steady eye on the stars. The longship rocks gently as waves lap against its sides. The sky above is muted gray, and the sea stretches outward in every direction, a cold, restless mirror. You've been rowing or perhaps simply watching for what feels like hours, maybe days. There's no land in sight, only the promise of it. Imagine sailing toward nothing visible. No coastline on the horizon, no map in your hand, only memory, tradition, and the whisper of stories passed from one mariner to the next. This was a Viking way. By the early 9th and 10th centuries, Viking explorers had already reached beyond the British Isles. The Norse had established settlements in Ireland, Scotland, and even ventured deep into Frankish lands. But it wasn't enough. They looked westward. Sagas tell us of voyages beyond the edge of the world. Some stories were grand, filled with storms and sea monsters. Others were practical, like the tale of Floki Vildrarson, who, guided by ravens, became one of the first Norsemen to deliberately sail to Iceland. It wasn't long before Iceland became a thriving Norse colony. From there, they pushed farther still, reaching Greenland, a land as stark and icy as its name is misleading. And beyond Greenland, a place called Vinland, thought to be part present-day Newfoundland in Canada. To put this into perspective, they had traveled thousands of miles across open water, centuries before Columbus, with no maps, no compass, no written instructions, just oral tradition, keen observation, and patient bravery. They watched the behavior of birds, noting how seabirds would fly inland toward nests in the evening. They examined cloud formations, which sometimes reflected land masses just beyond the horizon. And when fog rolled in, thick and damp and disorienting, they waited. They trusted the ship, the stars, and the sea. Supplies were minimal but carefully chosen. Barley flour, dried fish, preserved lamb, fermented drinks, and seal meat helped them survive long stretches without resupply. Skins of water were stored under deck, shaded from the sun. When rain came, it was caught in buckets or in sails and funneled into vessels. Sleep came in shifts. Blankets and cloaks were shared. There was little privacy, and yet a strange kind of companionship formed among the crew. They moved to the same rhythm, rowing, sleeping, waking, eating, as if their hearts beat in sync with the sea. They sang, softly, to pass the time, low rhythmic chants. Sometimes the navigator would tell stories of places beyond imagining, of gods who shaped the skies, of others who had sailed this way before. These stories weren't mere entertainment. They were navigation tools, encoded with memory, observation, and direction. One song might describe the scent of pine as land draws near. Another might recount the shape of distant cliffs, seen only on the clearest of mornings. Together, these sagas and songs became a living map, stored not in ink and parchment, but in the minds of men who had listened well. To find new land was not a certainty. Sometimes it was weeks before landfall. Sometimes land never came. But when it did, when the green hills and new shore finally rose from mist, it must have felt like the gods themselves had spoken. And they would step ashore, Unsure whether the place would offer hospitality or hardship, shelter or danger, life or loss. Still they came. Over and over again, they came. And so, the Viking world expanded, not through maps, but through memory, myth, and the patient study of stars and waves. The sea is not still. It never truly rests. Beneath your ship, it breathes slowly, steadily, rising and falling like the chest of some ancient creature. The longship creaks with each motion, its wooden ribs flexing in time with the waves. You look out and see nothing but water, stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky above is heavy with clouds. The wind shifts and it's colder now. This is the true Viking challenge. Not war, not conquest, but endurance in the face of the open ocean. To modernize, such voyages may seem reckless. To sail without modern tools, no compass, no sextant, no GPS, might seem like madness. But to the Norse sailors, it was not reckless. It was tradition, built on centuries of trial, memory, and an understanding of nature passed from one generation to the next. A Viking navigator would read the ocean like a manuscript. The color of the water, the shape of the waves, the movement of clouds, and even the behavior of whales and birds were clues, hints, signs pointing the way forward. One would note how deep blue waters often indicated great depth and open sea. Cloud banks sometimes mirrored the presence of distant land, their undersides reflecting the green of forest or the pale tone of ice-covered coasts. Whales swimming in a certain direction might lead toward colder currents. Seabirds flying low might be returning from feeding grounds on shore. Yet even with these signs, the ocean was cruel. Sudden storms could rise without warning. Winds could shift, and currents could drag a ship miles off course overnight. Icebergs drifted silently, half hidden beneath mist, posing lethal threats to even the sturdiest vessel. In these moments, there was no panic, only resolve. The crew, bound by routine, would respond in practiced silence. Sail furled or trimmed, oars extended, supplies checked, water protected, and then they would wait. In the stillness after a storm, when the sea was oddly calm and the sky a washed-out gray, it was said that the navigator could hear the world breathing. These moments, though unnerving, were revered. They were part of the rhythm, part of the cost of discovery. Below deck, where no light reached, some of the younger crew whispered prayers to Thor and Jord, god of the sea. Others, more practical, mended ropes or carved runes into bits of wood, tokens of luck or memory. These voyages demanded not just physical stamina, but a certain emotional quietness. One could not be loud with fear. One could not rage against the sky. The ocean would not respond. It simply was. Imagine weeks passing in this world. The sameness of the waves, the sound of oars, the crack of sails and wind, meals of hard bread and smoked meat, shared cloaks, dreamless sleep on a damp plank, a life reduced to necessity and rhythm. And still the stars would return. Even on the longest voyages, there were clear nights. And on those nights, the crew would gather their bearings once again. The North Star, always dependable, hung in the sky like a single nail pinning the heavens together. If they could see it, they could find their way home, or onward. That was a Viking gift, to endure the sea, to trust in its patterns, and to believe that beyond the horizon lay something worth finding. Not all made it. Some ships vanished. Some returned years later, battered and thinned. And some carved their legacy not in stone, but in the quiet routes they charted, invisible paths across the water, memorized and passed on like sacred song. So next time you look at the sea, still and wide, think of them, men without maps, with no stars but the ones they could see, and still they sailed. Now imagine nightfall at sea. The sun has disappeared behind the curve of the world, leaving behind a sky so vast, so quietly infinite, it seems to press downward. The stars appear slowly, not all at once, but in careful procession, like old friends returning after a long day. To a Viking sailor, this moment was sacred. There were no glowing dials, no humming electronics, no blinking GPS satellites overhead. There was only the sky, and it was enough. The night sky served as the Vikings' compass, clock, and calendar, all in one. Above them glowed Polaris, the North Star. It did not dance across the sky like the other stars. Instead, it remained mostly fixed in place, always due north. To find it was to find the direction of home. For centuries, this bright and dependable star served as a heavenly anchor, beside Polaris in quiet orbit, with the patterns the Norse came to know well. Ursa Major, the Great Bear, known for its dipper shape, used to trace a line directly to Polaris. In winter months, the Vikings would track Orion, the hunter, his belt of 3 stars marching steadily across the night. These were not just constellations. They were signposts, stories, inheritances from their ancestors. They had no written manuals. Instead, each navigator was trained from childhood to observe. They learned to see how constellations moved differently depending on time of year, how certain stars dipped low in summer or arced higher in winter, how the shape of the sky changed as one moved farther from home. And so the Vikings developed a kind of internal map, made of shifting star paths, horizon angles, and the rhythm of nightfall. They could tell not only which direction they were sailing, but how far they had traveled, and sometimes even how close land might be. Of course, the stars didn't always cooperate. Clouds, fog, or storms could hide them for days. That's where memory took over. That's where rhythm and routine mattered. In those moments, the navigator relied on instinct, a deep and practiced sense of where the ship ought to be and what direction it needed to go. On clearer nights, however, celestial navigation became a delicate art. They watched not just where stars were, but where they rose and where they set. Each movement told a story, a rotation of the heavens that spoke quietly to those who listened, and listen they did. Even the youngest crew members learned the names of stars in Norse. Some lost us now, and listen to how they were tied to gods, spirits, and old heroes. These weren't just lights in the sky. They were guides, protectors, and sometimes warnings. For example, it's believed that Soljad, or the Song of the Sun, was a medieval Norse poem passed down orally that blended spiritual and navigational wisdom. Part riddle, part prayer. It described how sun and stars should be read, and what moral lessons might be hidden in their patterns. This fusion of astronomy, mythology, and practical wisdom gave Viking navigators a unique mastery of the seas, not just as explorers, but as interpreters of the heavens. So imagine now the scene aboard a ship. It's quiet. The crew has finished their evening tasks. A small oil lamp swings gently by the mast. Above, a clear sky emerges, and one man, cloaked in fur, stands at the prow, tracing the stars with his eyes. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. He knows the way, and the stars know him. When the stars were hidden by cloud, by fog, or by the brightness of the day, the Vikings turned their gaze to another celestial body. The sun. The sun, though always moving, was a trusted companion. Its rising and setting offered structure to their daily rhythm, and its position in the sky provided an ever-changing but reliable guide. By observing the sun's height at noon and how its angle shifted with the seasons, Viking navigators developed a simple but effective sense of latitude, not as a number, as we would use today, but as a feeling of place. They could sense whether they were drifting too far north or too far south, simply by how the sun arced overhead. One of the most fascinating tools believed to have helped in this regard was the sunstone. Now imagine this, a rough-looking but slightly translucent crystal held up to a cloudy sky. As you rotate it, a band of light appears, glowing softly, even when the sun is hidden behind thick cloud cover. The Vikings may have used this optical trick, known today as birefringence, to locate the sun's position even in overcast conditions. While no definitive archaeological evidence has been found linking sunstones directly to Viking voyages, later medieval texts and Icelandic sagas mention such a tool. And considering their dependence on solar cues, it's not unreasonable to imagine these mariners using whatever nature provided, even refracted light in stone, to maintain their course. In brighter conditions, the Vikings may have employed sun compasses, simple devices made from wood or bone. One such artifact, found in Greenland, is believed to have been a sundial compass. With it, a navigator could mark the sun's shadow across a carved circle, then use the length and angle of the shadow to help determine direction, and perhaps even estimate time of day or season. But more than any single tool, the Vikings' greatest instrument was still their mind, trained through long observation, sharpened by repetition, and polished with storytelling. Each day, the sun would climb in the east and settle in the west, but the path it took, the height it reached, the color it glowed, these things changed depending on their location and the time of year. Over generations, Norse navigators noticed the patterns. They noticed when the light felt different, when shadows were too long or too short for the season. Even the color of sunlight held meaning. A dull, gray cast meant they were too far north, drifting toward ice. A warmer hue told of southern shores. These were not facts in a book. They were feelings lived through voyages and retold by fireside. Children were taught from an early age to watch the sky, to count hours by the shadow of a stick, to guess the hour by the tilt of the sun. Even the shape of their ships was oriented toward the rhythm of daylight and the changing seasons. These skills were not taught with rules, but with experience, passed on in poems, parables, and murmured advice before sleep. A navigator might say, "When your shadow is twice your height before noon, you've drifted too far." Or, "If the morning light strikes a prow at an angle, you've turned east by mistake." This was not mathematics. It was intuition, grown carefully, cultivated like a garden. Imagine the scene: a Viking longship deep in the ocean. The sky is pale and clouded, the sun hidden. But the navigator squints upward, holding a crystal to the light. A faint glow arcs across it, just enough to guess the sun's location. The course is corrected. No one else on board says a word. They simply trust, because this is how it has always been. If you could open a Viking navigator's mind and look inside, you wouldn't find charts or coordinates. You'd find stories, songs, rhythms, a map made of memory, woven into words and repetition. These were the celestial maps of the Norse world, not sketched on parchment, not engraved in stone, but carried in the mind, vivid and alive. You see, Viking navigation was not a solitary discipline. It was a shared tradition, passed from one generation to the next, like a flame that must not be dropped. Picture a winter hall, warm with firelight, echoing with low voices. An old sailor sits by the hearth, tracing the path of a voyage into the air with his finger. "Follow the bear," he says, referring to Ursa Major. When it tips its bowl toward the sea, you're near the Faroe Islands. When it lies flat, you're too far west. These weren't literal maps. They were visual metaphors, learned by experience and remembered through tales. A navigator learned not to memorize stars individually, but to understand their movement, how they rose, rotated, and vanished with the changing night. Vikings also described direction in relational terms. East was not just east. It was a morning path where the sun returned. North was homeward. West was where the stories went, to Iceland, to Greenland, to Vinland, to the unknown. They learned the sequence of stars, how Polaris stood still while others wheeled around it, how certain constellations rose just before dawn in late spring, and what that meant about one's place on the sea. Each voyage refined their internal compass, not through numbers, but through pattern recognition. There may have been primitive sky charts, carve wooden staves, or etch bone markers, used to remind, not to instruct. These were more mnemonic than mathematical. One such item, the runic calendar stick or primstaff, marked seasons and holy days, possibly aligning festivals with certain celestial events. Whether it served a navigational function is debated, but its presence shows how deeply entwined Norse life was with the stars. Another possible memory aid, navigational chants. Short verses describing the stars rising and setting, the color of clouds at certain latitudes, the timing of tides. These chants were rhythmic, easily repeated and hard to forget, just like sea shanties in later centuries. And while Viking runestones often told of conquest or commemorated the dead, some may have hinted at routes, landmarks, or coastal memories, a mix of myth and map. Even when sailing by day, memory ruled. The height of the sun, the pull of the tide, the angle of a mountain seen days before. These things were logged not in ink but in thought. The navigator's greatest strength wasn't a crystal or compass. It was his ability to listen to the sky, the sea, and the silence between waves. He remembered when the stars vanished. He remembered when the birds stopped circling. He remembered the shape of clouds before Iceland came into view. And so the tradition continued. Fathers to sons, elders to apprentices, one sailor to the next, all learning a sky that could not be owned, only known. So, tonight, as you look at your ceiling or perhaps the sky outside your window, consider how the Vikings must have stared into that same deep space. Not with confusion, but with calm confidence. The stars were their teachers, their companions, their reminders of home. And for those who truly listened, the sky was never silent. The wind is steady. The sail is taut. The stars above whisper their familiar patterns. And yet, beneath the calm, there is something stirring among the crew. It is not fear, not quite. It is anticipation. The thrill of the unknown. Imagine yourself among them, aboard a Viking longship, gliding across the great Atlantic in the year 1000. You've been at sea for weeks, the horizon unchanging, the days a rhythmic repetition of rowing, resting, watching. Your only guides, the sun, the stars, and the memories of those who come before. But now, something has shifted. Birds begin circling low and wide, not the kind that feed from sea life, but the kind that nest inland. The water changes color, just slightly, with silt and warmth not found in deep ocean. And then someone called from the prow, a distant shape barely visible in the mist. Land. To a Viking crew, discovering a new coastline was a quiet miracle. Not like a thunderclap, not like a flag-planting parade, but something slow and reverent. The land approached at the pace of the tide, its mountains faint silhouettes, its beaches pale ribbons against the sea. The first to step ashore would often remain silent for a moment, just listening. The wind in unfamiliar trees, the smell of different soil, the sense that they were first, or perhaps not the first, to arrive. These discoveries were made not by chance, but by celestial navigation. The Vikings reached places as far west as Greenland and even Vinland, what we now believe was part of North America, all without maps, without instruments, and without a written record to guide them. Instead, they carried with them the sky. Historians believe that voyages like those of Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, relied heavily on the same techniques you just heard about, navigating by Polaris, by the shifting arc of the sun, by the feel of the sea. Oral tradition tells us that Leif was blown off course while heading for Greenland, only to discover rich new lands where forests met beaches and salmon crowded the rivers. These weren't random detours. They were voyages shaped by observation, by instinct, and by a willingness to follow where the stars pointed. Each landfall brought with it a new chapter in Norse exploration. Some places were settled like Iceland, where the stars aligned with the terrain, where the sea was kinder. Others were visited and left behind, remembered in sagas and whispered songs, like Vinland, with its mysterious self-sown wheat and grapevines in abundance. The discovery of these unknown lands also deepened the Norse understanding of the sky. They saw how constellations change depending on latitude. They noticed new star patterns at lower horizons. And they began to realize that the world was larger, more complex, more connected than even their stories had dared to dream. But they never wrote it down. To us, this seems strange. No journals, no maps, no charts tucked safely away. But to the Vikings, knowledge was breath, meant to be spoken, shared, remembered. A chart could be lost. A memory, if passed on properly, could live forever. So these celestial voyages were logged in sagas, in the rhythm of verse, in the naming of stars and coasts and headlands. Some of these names remain, passed through generations, softened by time and tongue. They remind us that long before telescopes, before latitude lines, before ink on nautical paper, there were men and women who looked at the stars and trusted them enough to cross oceans. And remarkably, they arrived. The horizon recedes, but memory stays. For the Vikings, each voyage added another thread to a tapestry that would stretch across generations, sewn not with ink, but with words, rituals, and celestial signs. Their discoveries, while often shrouded in mystery and softened by time, left an enduring mark on the history of exploration. Imagine a Norse settlement in Greenland, where the sea is colder, the stars tilt slightly lower in the sky, and the rhythm of life clings to the edge of survival. The people here, descendants of sailors and sky watchers, still track the movement of the sun as it grazes the horizon in long arcs, still watch for familiar stars to peek through winter fog. The Viking voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, and the stories of others that may have sailed even farther, all relied on the same ancient method, navigation by the sky. And though the voyages eventually ceased, halted by shifting climates, dwindling supplies, or changing priorities, the legacy of their exploration quietly persisted. For centuries after, sailors across Europe began to adopt more systematic approaches to understanding the sky. The magnetic compass would eventually arrive from China, and charts would grow more sophisticated. But before that, before lines and angles were drawn on parchment, the Vikings had shown that the heavens could be trusted. Modern scholars continue to unravel the mysteries of Norse navigation. Some compare Viking techniques to Polynesian wayfinding, noting how both cultures use stars, ocean swells, and wildlife to cross vast waters. Others explore Norse myths and sagas for clues hidden in poetic language, veiled instructions passed as metaphor. In recent years, historians and archaeologists have used computer simulations and satellite reconstructions to test whether known Viking routes could have been followed using just celestial navigation. The results? Often surprisingly accurate. Experiments like the Vinland Revisited expeditions have recreated Viking sea journeys using traditional longships, confirming that, with the right training and observation, these voyages were not only possible, they were highly skilled endeavors. There's also growing interest in Viking astronomical knowledge from a linguistic standpoint. The Old Norse language includes a rich vocabulary of terms for direction, light, sky, and sea. Phrases like Ostaveg, Eastern Way, and Norn, Northward, were not just directional. They were deeply cultural, tied to identity and memory. And perhaps this is the real legacy, not the distance traveled or the lands touched, but the mindset. To look at the sky and not see chaos, but order. To stand at the edge of a continent and not feel fear, but curiosity. To sail into unknown waters not with a map, but with trust in what had been taught, and what could be remembered. This legacy endures in the quiet details. The naming of stars, the rhythm of rowing, the first call of land spotted in the fog. It endures in how we understand the sea not as a void, but as a bridge between worlds. And though much was lost, much never written, the sky still holds their secrets. Every night, the stars still move as they once did. Polaris still points north. The Great Bear still turns. And if you listen closely, you might still hear the quiet chant of those early sailors, measuring time by the sun, finding hope in a sky full of light. Long after the oars were stilled, long after the sails had fallen silent, the memory of Viking voyages lived on in the stars. In the ancient Norse worldview, the sky was not just a navigational aid. It was a cosmic mirror, a space where gods, fate, and memory intertwined. The constellations above were not random to Viking eyes. They were figures from myth, omens from the divine, and beacons of ancestral memory. Imagine a Viking child lying on their back beside a fire, watching their elder trace shapes in the sky. There is Thor's hammer. The elder might whisper, pointing toward a group of stars. And there is the great elk, crossing the winter sky. When he vanishes, spring is near. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were mnemonics, carefully constructed to preserve knowledge in an age before written manuals. By embedding astronomical patterns into myth, the Norse preserved their navigational wisdom across generations, ensuring that even a child's bedtime story could one day help them steer through fog. There's strong evidence that Viking societies had detailed celestial folklore, much of which survives in Icelandic sagas and skaldic poetry. Though we don't know exactly how they visualized constellations, scholars suspect that many were interpreted differently from the Greco-Roman models. Where one culture saw a lion or a hunter, the Vikings may have seen a boar, a serpent, or a longship crossing the heavens. And they believed that the sky could communicate with the earth through signs, alignments, and even the behavior of animals under certain stars. Certain times of the year, particularly around solstices and equinoxes, held ceremonial importance. Some Viking temples, like those believed to exist at Uppsala, may have been built with attention to solar movement, aligning ritual spaces with dawn or dusk on sacred days. These alignments weren't just spiritual. They may have also served practical purposes, marking times of plan to migrate or to set sail. In this way, memory was not just in the stars. It was confirmed by them. The sky also offered a strange kind of comfort. When venturing far from home, a Norse traveler could still look up and see the same stars that hung above their homeland. Polaris, always north. The slow sweep of the Great Bear. The rising of Orion, or whatever mythic shape they saw there, just before dawn. These were not just lights. They were anchors. And so, whether walking the icy ground of Greenland, rowing along the fjords of Norway, or discovering a distant forested coast in Vinland, the Vikings carried a sky of memory with them. To this day, stargazing carries a similar magic. The stars are unchanged in their rhythm. The same constellations appear overhead now as they did 1,000 years ago. When we look up, we are sharing the same celestial storybook. Perhaps you've had that feeling, standing outside on a clear night, letting your eyes adjust, watching the stars appear one by one. It's humbling, it's grounding, it's ancient, and in that moment, you're not so far from the deck of a Viking ship, listening to the gentle slap of waves, gazing at the same constellations, trusting the quiet wisdom of the sky. The journey was always dangerous, the outcome uncertain, but the stars were always there. Not all knowledge lives in books. In the Viking world, wisdom traveled from mouth to ear, whispered, sung, chanted, from one generation to the next, like wind passing over waves. To understand how the Vikings learned to navigate without compasses or maps, we must first understand how they preserved and passed down knowledge, not through ink or scroll, but through a living oral tradition, a form of history and instruction as old as time. Imagine an apprentice sitting quietly beside a seasoned helmsman as twilight settles over sea. The elder begins not with charts, but with a tale. When the stars dance close together, and the wind smells of ire and moss, we are near the fjords, he might say. It's not a riddle. It's instruction. Over weeks, months, and seasons, the apprentice listens. No lecture, no list. Instead, story after story, voyage after voyage, filled with references to constellations, currents, birds, and weather. These tales aren't just for entertainment. They're mnemonic devices. This system of education, deeply personal, observational, and experiential, was known across the Viking world. It emphasized pattern recognition, memory, and intuition. You didn't learn to sail by reading. You learned by watching the sky, feeling the wind, and listening to the ones who had made it home. Such traditions often began in childhood. Norse children, especially those born into seafaring families, were introduced early to the language of the stars. They would memorize seasonal skies, watch the movement of flocks and fish, and internalize the rhythm of the tides. Certain families, particularly those known for captaining longships, carried reputations as navigators. Their status rested not on wealth, but on the depth of their remembered knowledge. A wrong heading could mean disaster, so the weight of that knowledge was both an honor and a burden. Over time, certain phrases and verses became standard, short poetic lines that captured essential truths. When Thor's belt tilts, the morning comes, or the bear leads home. Easy to recall, impossible to forget. These navigational sayings were often paired with ritual practices. A captain might always recite a chant before leaving port, not from superstition alone, but because it set the rhythm of thought, reinforcing navigational routines. This oral knowledge wasn't secretive. It was shared freely because its survival depended on being spoken, but it was also tested. Only those who had voyaged under stars, who had returned after storms, were trusted to pass it on. In this way, the tradition of sky-guided sailing didn't just survive. It evolved. Every voyage added new details to the mental map. A bird call here, a change in cloud color there, a lesson taught not in theory, but in windburn and tide pull. And so the stars weren't just lights overhead. They were verses, part of a living language passed between generations of voyagers who dared to cross the open sea. Even today, among traditional navigators in other parts of the world, like the Polynesians, we see similar methods. Stories, chants, gestures, all tied to sky. It's a reminder that oral tradition was once the most advanced form of education on the planet. For the Vikings, these sky teachings formed the backbone of exploration. They allowed one generation to build on the experience of the last, to go farther, to return wiser, to speak again of what they saw. And in those stories, quietly and without ceremony, the stars continued to guide. When the sails were furled and the oars laid to rest, when the sea was calm and the longships returned home, the stories began. These stories, passed from tongue to tongue and heart to heart, were later known as the sagas. Imagine a winter night in Iceland. The wind howls beyond the timber walls of a longhouse, but within, it's warm. Flames crackle and people gather close, wrapped in wool, listening to the voice of a skald, the storyteller, as he begins. There once was a man named Eric, bold and wild, who sought green lands beyond the sea. To modern readers, sagas might seem like fanciful tales, full of gods, revenge, dragons, and feuds. But hidden within them, beneath the drama and poetic flourishes, lie breadcrumbs of truth, clues about how the Vikings lived and, more importantly, how they voyaged. Consider the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. These texts, preserved on parchment in medieval Iceland and recopied through generations, tell of Leif Erikson's journey westward, how he left Greenland and found Vinland, a lush place with wild grapes and tall trees. The sagas do not mention compasses or charts. Instead, they describe sailing with the sun behind the ship, or sighting land after days of fog, or birds appearing just before landfall. These may seem like casual details, but to a trained eye, they're navigational cues. Clues passed through story. One passage describes how a sailor released birds from the ship. If they flew straight up and returned, there was no land nearby. If they flew off and didn't return, they'd found something solid ahead. It's a quiet moment in the saga, but a powerful example of Viking observational skill. Some researchers believe that these elements, often presented poetically, were deliberate. The sagas were not dry instruction manuals, but memory palaces designed to encode complex knowledge in memorable form. Even names of places may hold navigational hints. Helgeland, Markland, Vinland, possibly named for their rocks, forests, and vines, creating a mental map not miles, but of landmarks and sensations. And though many sagas were written down centuries after the events they described, they still reflect a deeply oral culture, where accuracy depended not on paper but on practice, performance, and communal remembering. Each retelling was an act of education. The skald was not merely entertaining. He was preserving routes, patterns, and warnings. Which currents ran strong near Iceland? Which stars heralded stormy weather? Which times of year the sea calm enough to cross westward? So the sagas, in all their myth and exaggeration, carried truth. Not literal truth, perhaps, but navigational truth. They spoke of possibility, of where to go, when to leave, what signs to follow. In this way, they became part of the Viking toolkit, not carved in stone, but sung into memory. We see echoes of this tradition today in indigenous navigation systems across the Pacific and Arctic, ways of remembering the sea not as an abstract grid, but as a living story unfolding across generations. To the Vikings, each successful voyage deepened the tale. Each return home added a verse, a correction, a caution. Their collective memory became as powerful as any map, and in the quiet flicker of the fire, with the stars outside unchanged, the tales were told again. Today, we look up at the stars through telescopes, with apps that identify constellations by name. We fly across oceans using satellites, guided by digital maps with glowing routes and estimated arrival times. And yet, the question lingers. How did they do it? How did the Vikings, with no compass, no map, no written guides, cross seas wide and treacherous? The answer is not only in the stars above, but in the curiosity that burns quietly beneath them. In recent decades, historians, archaeologists, and navigational scholars have taken a deeper interest in Viking wayfinding, not merely as a mystery to solve, but as a legacy to honor, a reminder of the astonishing skill once embedded in memory, passed by voice, and shaped by the rhythm of the sea. Archaeological finds, such as the Unhurried disc, often referred as a Viking sunstone compass, hint at the possibility that Vikings developed clever ways to track the sun's position even in cloudy conditions. Some researchers believe this calcite crystal could have polarized light, allowing sailors to find the sun's direction by rotating the stone. Even without direct sunlight, others point to sundials carved on wooden dials, calibrated for different times of year, allowing rough estimates of direction and daylight. These tools were not precise by modern standards, but in practice hands, they were remarkably effective. In laboratories and field experiments, scientists have tested these methods. Using reconstructed longships and sunstones, navigators have attempted to cross known Viking routes with minimal modern assistance, relying only on environmental cues. Time and again, these tests show what the sagas always suggested, that celestial memory is real and that the Vikings are profoundly attuned to it. Meanwhile, digital reconstructions through computer simulations and satellite overlays show how Viking voyages align with migratory bird patterns, seasonal winds, and prevailing currents. What seem mythical now appears scientifically plausible. Modern mariners and scholars alike express admiration for this form of navigation, not simply for the outcome, but for its method, the quiet confidence, the embodied knowledge, the trust in observation over abstraction. There's even a growing movement among sailors today to relearn these ancient techniques, not to replace GPS, but to reawaken a connection to the sea that has, for many, become distant. These efforts are more than historical curiosity. They're a form of remembrance, a way to honor those who once stood at the shore, looked up at the stars, and dared to cross the unknown. without engines, charts, or coordinates. In many ways, the story of Viking navigation is a story of human resilience and wonder. It reminds us that long before satellites mapped the planet, people read the sky like a book, interpreted clouds like ink on vellum, and found meaning in the arc of birds above an endless sea. And even today, if you find yourself on a quiet shore at night with no screen, no device, just the hum of wind and wave, you can still feel it. The sky speaks softly. The stars still hold their places. The sea still waits. And somewhere, if you close your eyes and listen, you might hear the creak of a longship's hull, the rhythmic dip of oars, and the whisper of a voice repeating old wisdom. Follow the light that never moves. The bear turns, but the Norse stays. 1,000 years may pass, but that voice still echoes. And now, dear listener, the sea has calmed. The sails have been furled, the oars drawn in, and the stars, those ancient companions, still glitter above, unchanged since the time of the Vikings. If you've made it this far, perhaps your eyes are heavy. Perhaps your thoughts drift like a longship on still water. That is as it should be, because this is boring history for sleep, and I'm the sleepy historian. Tonight, we followed in the quiet wake of the Norse. We walked their shores, watched their skies, listened to their stories whispered in sagas and remembered in stars. No maps, no compasses, just sun, wind, bird, and memory. And in doing so, perhaps we found a little more than history. Perhaps we rediscovered something older, a slower rhythm. A way of knowing that does not rely on glowing screens or satellite beacons, but on presence, patience, and patterns whispered by the earth and sky. History isn't always thrilling. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it drifts, and sometimes in its stillness we find peace. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you a little comfort. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something strangely soothing in knowing we're all here together, scattered across the world, falling asleep to the same old tales under the same old stars. So dim the lights, let the sky settle, let the myth unfold, and the gods whisper once more. And sleep, if it hasn't already found you, is surely close. Good night.